men,
who do you think is, in part, in a grand step, playing for that? Like, who do you think is contributing to that largely?
What do you mean? Contributing to?
A lot of the rhetoric that you hear from women is basically like, oh, you know, that woman expects too much. I'm going to be able to take care of him. I'm going to provide him X, Y, or Z. But when it comes to
100%.
When it comes to the practical application of it, as we kind of see sometimes, when you give a man so much that's not healthy for him, it's not nurturing, it's not peace, it's not something that you're from your natural femininity. It's basically like you're taking yourself for granted, you're taking your own virtues for whatever, you're letting him take advantage of you basically. But it's also like, I don't know, I kind of lost the stream of thought, but it's pointless, it's useless. Like, it's basically trying to live up to a man's role, which it just doesn't naturally play out that way.
Yeah.
There's something to be said about the fact that if you say to a woman, make me a sandwich, that's meant to be derogatory. But if you say to a man, do like mow the lawn, he's like, okay.
Right. Right.
It's my role.
I don't know. I just never seen sexism in my personal life, so I don't even know what you're talking about, really. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Mental health.
Do you guys
labor?
Do you guys think that
safety?
The fact that men get treated more harshly in the court of law is sexist?
Yes.
Towards
Yes.
I don't think it's sexist.
No?
I think that, as we've discussed with psychopathy, basically, like when a woman demonstrates psychopathy, because of her physical disadvantages, she can only go so far. When a man demonstrates psychopathy, he can brutalize someone, basically. So I'm like, in that respect, I still think that there is supposed to be that gender binary.
So you think that if a woman puts a gun to somebody's head and pulls the trigger, a man does the exact same thing, they should be treated differently?
I think they should be treated exactly the same in that respect. It's the same crime.
Yeah.
But men tend to be more prone to that type of
So
behavior.
if they do it to a like a more extreme extent, then I would agree they get treated differently.
Yes.
But for the same crime, women get lesser sentences.
I'd say it's because we're still trying to deprogram or deconstruct, unfortunately, that binary. Because women, when they committed a murder back in the 1800s, they weren't even like barely prosecuted basically for it. We were seen as being the docile sex. We were seen as being politically neutral when we didn't vote. We were seen as being like the weaker vessel. And society took care of us, and they basically took that into account. Nowadays, they're still trying to deprogram that. They're still trying to deconstruct that.
Would you disagree with just like no like other circumstances, that crime happening? Would you think that it's sexist that a man gets a worse punishment in terms of the prison system?
It is sexist, yeah.
It's definitely sexist.
Well, I mean, there's actually a case that's kind of recently related to us, and I forgot if we had brought this up on the previous show. There was recently a woman who stabbed her boyfriend to death, she stabbed him 100 times in a weed-induced psychosis.
Oh yeah, I heard
and
that.
she got off on 100. She murdered someone, manslaughter. She got 100 hours of community service, 0 time in prison, 0 time in jail. She got probation for 2 or 3 years, and got 100 hours of community service for killing somebody.
Imagine if we did that and then we just went Afro man because I got high.
If you were to reverse the genders, same circumstances. Oh my God, he was in a weed-induced psychosis.
Yeah.
Bro, that dude's doing years in fucking prison.
I think the reason I push back on this one is mostly, what is the end objective then? Do you want men and women to be socially basically punished at the same level? Or
Absolutely.
Do you want, Or do you want men to continue being full of their agency and to basically say women don't have this level of agency? They're going to be basically put back into their quote-unquote place.
I think that there are certain like examples of things where if you take another human life, then in any circumstance that is something that is worthy of a very severe punishment. I don't
Gypsy
think
Rose?
necessarily.
She should have never went to jail.
I mean, if you
wait, I'm not
it's
familiar. I heard of her.
circumstantial.
What was?
Yeah.
Can somebody give us like a 10-second recap?
She killed her mom.
So pretty much her mom kept her like secluded her whole life, put her in a wheelchair, like made up to her and all these doctors saying she had all these diseases, that she was sick, she'd never be able to walk, do this, that, and the third. Turns out Gypsy Rose was like finding out she can walk, she didn't have all these sicknesses. Her mom was just keeping her pretty much hostage. So she killed her mom, her and her boyfriend at the time.
Yeah, her mom would like physically abuse her, drug her, and force her to pretend she's paralyzed her whole life.
Yeah.
See, I think that there's probably some sort of a moral justification for what they did then. I also think that people who do bad things to children, there's a moral justification to kill them, or at least, use them.
I agree.
But I mean,
we're talking
I'm not
about-
familiar with the case, but I'm assuming that these alleged abuses were provable. Like it was. Mm-hmm. I mean, again,
they made
I don't know the court.
But that has
I don't
nothing
know
to
the
do
court
with it.
story,
We were
but
talking.
again, like
I
agree with all of these points, but I also ultimately say that a point in feminist literature is to make equality so much so that women are also drafted into military conscription. They want to reach this point where we are truly
to the front line,
and then get half of the front lines mowed down, bro.
Yeah, half our
It's
population
like-
is
that's
gone
more of
because
like,
you're putting those women who can't physically
equals
survive
equal.
out there, right?
the consequence of that
Equals
is
equal.
the consequence
it's
of that
always talking
is
about who's stronger.
if you don't like modern women clamoring for equality, maybe push
this is
away
all it
from
takes.
those issues.
It doesn't take strength to pull
I
trigger.
see what you mean, but like those are different. Like for example, women being drafted. The reason why that women don't get drafted and shouldn't get drafted is because they're physically inferior to men, or they're physically inferior to men, and that's why.
True, yes.
Men make better warriors.
But I completely agree. But once again, feminism does not account for reality. It wants us to be legally, politically, in every virtue, in every way, the same.
But you've got some of them at the moment. But then there's still all of this like these feminists fighting for equality in every single regard, except for going on the oil rigs and except for driving the ice road trucks, which is essentially your point, and I do agree with you. But with the specific case of murder, I think that if you kill someone and you do murder in the first degree, you deserve a very severe punishment. Because I don't see the difference, unless you want to say that women are not as in control of their faculties, which I haven't seen the literature on.
No.
I do agree that yes, if someone kills someone, it doesn't matter what sex they are, they should receive the same punishment. But I do think that there's a reason why men and women have always been treated differently in society, and it's to reinforce the fact that there's a
I agree with that. I agree with you, but just in terms of murder, it's a bit different, I think.
And I mean, you also made the argument that there's like a cohort of feminists out there that are trying to equalize the draft. I mean, I just don't see any evidence for that, really. I don't think there's a large swath of women or feminists who are trying to get equalization in the draft. And I mean, you feminists and women have had over 100 years to make that an equal thing. So really, when it comes to feminism, you're saying, well, there's this cohort of feminists who want equality in all realms. I actually disagree. Feminism is purely in the most generous sense of how I define feminism. It's a woman's advocacy movement, and it goes against women's advocacy to advocate for the equalization of the draft, because nobody wants to be drafted. However, the reality is men are the only ones that are subject to military conscription. So what feminism is it's purely, again, in its most generous sense, I think feminism is much more nasty than how I'm defining it. In the best, most good light way I can frame it, feminism is women's advocacy. But here's the difference. If feminism is not a fight for equality, because if some version of equality comes to the detriment of women and not their benefit, said feminists will not fight for said equality. If you don't stand to benefit in some way by the introduction of some type of equality, aka the equalization of military conscription in the draft, feminists aren't going to fight for it, even though that is the supposed and alleged mission statement of feminism.
Are you familiar with Phyllis Schlafly?
Yes, Phyllis Schlafly.
Not really, no.
So she was trying to, or not she, but rather the feminists of the 70s were trying to propose the Equal Rights Amendment, which would make military conscription necessary for women.
50 years later.
That being said, no.
It's not there yet.
Feminism has always been for a minority of women. The majority of women have always resisted it to the social conditioning that they've received. So for example, what we see nowadays is women rejecting the idea of like redefining gender, redefining sex. But unfortunately, what the establishment pushes is for that minority of women's voices, because it will fractalize society to a point where we're all more controllable. But feminism has always been something that every single generation has opposed. So during the Equal Rights Amendments, they basically posed that women and men should be exactly the same.
I would say that I get what
has
you're saying
feminism
there,
been opposed?
But yeah, over the last 20 years or so,
the anti-suffragette movement has always, there's always been.
But look over the last 20 years.
Feminism is the culture. Feminism is the mainstream. Feminism has its claws in every system and every institution in this country. If you look at the higher education system, if you look at corporations, if you look at governments, if you look at media, if you look at news, if you look at journalism, these are very like feminist influence institutions and systems.
And also the podcast that we're on right now is a perfect example of it. And all of the other podcasts that have been sort of in the more manosphere, red pill space, they get demonized to no end because finally some people are actually talking to men in the modern world. And these podcasts get called toxic masculinity and you guys hate women and all that, when really it's just a bunch of men getting together to try and figure out how to sort of navigate the modern dating world. And then you get these podcasts where we come and speak to you guys, and we might call you delusional at times, etc. But yeah, so these podcasts are a perfect example of the way that if you dare to question feminism in the modern world, you will get dragged from pillar to post.
I completely agree, and the same thing.
Major.
And the same thing happens to women, where if you question feminism, you're considered anti-woman. That's always been the rhetoric, the tactic that they've used since the dawn of time. And every iteration of feminism that we're acquainted with is the one that came from the generation before, that established it as the mode of academia, of psychiatry, of media, of X, Y, or Z. So that's why it's like in every generation, you basically have to look back to the paleoconservative era where that was the dominant culture and think, okay, well, if they reflect the same mindset that we have nowadays, where we're resisting the new but wanting to basically retain the old, and we have some criticisms of what's currently going on, then maybe then our quote-unquote progress should basically be a return to tradition.